Hello everyone and welcome to Beginner's Code. Today we are going to be looking at creating a web browser BMI calculator using HTML, CSS and JavaScript. So the first thing we're going to do is we've created a BMI calculator directory, and inside of this we just need three different files. The first will be our index.html, the second will be our main.css, and then finally the main.js. So our index.html, we'll just use the HTML5 boilerplate, and we'll change the title to say BMI calculator. And then inside of the head, we will also link to our main.css file, so main.css. And then inside the body, we want to start by creating a div. So we'll give this a class of calc. And then inside of the div, we will have a heading and two paragraph tags that we will then input some results to. So the heading one will just have a class of heading. And then inside of this, we'll just say BMI calculator. And now underneath the heading one, we want to use a paragraph tag, and this will have an ID of result. So we use the hashtag symbol. And then inside this, we'll just say your BMI is. And then the next one, we will have another paragraph tag that also uses the hashtag symbol. And this will have the ID of weight result. And then we can just pass in weight type. And now we have our main headings done, we can now actually start looking at the user input. So we'll create a new div, and this will have a class of user input, and then we will actually use the input, and we'll have the type of text, we'll have an ID of height, and we will just use the placeholder, and we'll say enter your height, and then we'll just say 1.5 meters to give them an example so they know it's in meters. And then we'll use another input. This will also be text. This ID instead will be weight, and we will also have a placeholder that says enter your weight, and we'll just say 80 kilograms just so people know. Now we want to have, before we do this, we want to actually wrap these two inputs in a div. So we'll create a new div, and this will have a class of numbers, so it's an easy way to identify it. And then we'll just move these both up. And now outside of this div, we can now create another div, and that will just have the class of button. And here we're going to actually have an input that submits what the user has entered in the input. So input, and we will just say submit, and then the value we will say calculate, and we will just pass in ID of button, and we will then put in an onClick, and this will reflect the JavaScript that we're going to write. So at the moment we haven't actually written the function that will run when the submit button is clicked, but for the time being we will pass in the name of the function, true result, and we'll put open close parentheses just so that we know once we've clicked on the submit button it will actually call the JavaScript code. So outside of this div and at the very bottom of our body, we can then link to our script file, and here we can just say main.js. So that is the HTML done. So if we move over to our main.css file, we can start actually looking at how to style. So if we open our index.html, you can see now this is how it's laid out. There's not really that much styling to it. So if we head back to our main.css, the first thing we'll do is we'll target the body, and we'll say display flex, justify content to the center, align items to the center, and then we will give it a background color of 8F8AA5. And if I save this and then just refresh here, we have a nice background to it, and everything is centered in the middle. So we head back here. Next, we want to look at the .calculator div. So it is the div that actually wraps around the whole of our code. So we'll say .calc, and we'll use the full stop just like we did when we were actually putting the class in. So the dot represents the class, a hashtag represents the ID. So here we'll also say display flex, justify content to the center, align items to the center, flex direction. We actually want to change to column so that we have everything moving down rather than in a row. And then we will change the background color to 233365, and we will give the width 60% so that we can actually see that this is now 60% of the body tag, because it inherits from the parent tag. So the body tag is 100%, and then this calc is 60% of the body tag. So back to our code editor. After we've done the width, we want to change the color, and we'll pass in A58B65, and if we save that, we now have a nice little gold color to the actual text. And now we can start adding some padding. So either side we want to give it 40 pixels. Sorry, to the top and bottom we want to give it 40 pixels, and the width is perfect, so we don't need to change that. So now if we refresh this, we have a little bit more space at the top and a little bit at the bottom as well. Now, just to give the actual calculator, or this calc div here, a little bit more breathing space at the top, we just want to give it a margin, and that will push it all down slightly. So if we head back to here, we'll say margin top, and we'll pass in 40 pixels. So now we have a little bit more breathing space. It just looks a little bit easier on the eye. Now we can target our weight result, and because this was an ID, we'll pass in the hashtag at the start. So weight result, and just to make sure that that has connected, I will just paste that there. So that is the same. So the weight result, we just want to give a margin bottom, and that will be 60 pixels. And this just gives us a little bit more space here for the JavaScript that's going to actually come in. Now we can use our user int, and the user int is the div that is wrapped around all the user inputs. So this div around these here. So if we come back over to our main.css, we can then change certain things. So we'll do the display and we'll change it to flex. We'll then justify the content to the center and align items to the center. And now we want to have the flex direction as column. So now if we save that and then refresh, we now have the calculator button in the middle. Next, we can start targeting the actual div that's wrapped around the two user inputs for the height and the weight. So we'll target the .numbers. So .numbers, and inside the numbers we'll do exactly the same. So display flex, justify content to the center, align items to the center, and here we actually want to have the flex direction set to row. So it will keep it as it is like that. Otherwise, if we changed it to column, it would look like that. So row works a lot better for what we actually are trying to do here. So now we've got that div sorted out, we can then start looking at the specific things that we have on our page. So we'll look at the heading, and the heading is just for the H1. And just to make it look a little bit easier on the eye, we'll give it a little bit of letter spacing, so 0.05 EM. And if we just refresh that, it just boosts it out a little bit. Next, we'll have a look at the buttons. So we'll have the ID of button, and that will specifically target this input that we have here. So hashtag button, and we'll say margin, and we'll say 40 pixels and then 0 pixels. So that's 40 to the top and the bottom and 0 to the right and left. And then we'll have padding of 10 pixels by 30 pixels. And we'll say border of none, and then border radius, we will give 10 pixels. So if I save that and then come back to here, we have a nice rounded button. Now we can change the background color to A58B65, and then we will just change the actual color, sorry, the color, not the columns, to 233365. So if we save this and then come back to here, we have a button that actually corresponds and relates to the same color palette that we're using. Now we can the final things that we have left to target are the two inputs. So if we start by using dot numbers, so that represents the div, and then we'll say input. So that will target whatever input is inside the dot numbers div. So both of these will be targeted, which is perfect. So here, here we'll say margin, and then we'll say 0 and 20 pixels. We'll say border of none, and then we'll say border bottom, and we'll give it a 1 pixel solid, and then A58B65. We'll say background color of 233365, and then we'll give the actual color the same, so A58B65, so that's a slightly gold tint. And then we want to give an alignment to it. So before I do this, if I just comment that out and save it, if we come back to here, we now have these styled slightly, so they look a little bit more appealing. And if we uncomment this, we can then give this a text align of center, and it hasn't really done much, but if we were to make the width of these a lot bigger, then it would be centered rather than on the left hand side. So now we have our main.css done. We have the HTML file styled, and it's pretty easy to actually type in what we want. But if we press calculate, nothing actually happens. So now, just to make sure that we have our main.js file connected, we'll do a console.log, and we'll just say hello world. Save that, come back to here, and if we inspect and head over to our console, we have hello world here. So we have our main.js file all set up, which is perfect. So now inside of this main.js, there is 3 functions that we want to write. So the first is for user input. The second takes the user input and works out the body mass index. And then the third checks to see what the body mass index is and checks to see whether or not it falls into a specific category of underweight, overweight, obese, or healthy. So the first thing that we're going to do is we'll just create a function, and it will say user input. So now inside of this, we want to grab the 2 values that are entered by a user into the inputs. So var, and we'll say h is equal to document.getElementById, and we'll just pass in height, and then we'll say .value, and then we'll say var w equals document.getElementById, and here we'll pass in weight, and then we'll also .value. So here, whatever's been typed in will be stored inside of this h or w variable. Now we want to have an array so that we can store all of the different values, or so that we can store the values and then we can actually grab them through indexing. So here we can say var result is equal to an empty array, and then we can just say var float h is equal to, and because we want to change whatever the user has entered into a float, we can then pass the variable into it. So we'll use the pass float, and we'll just pass in the value of h, or the variable h, and we'll say float w, and that will be exactly the same, just with the w. And now that we have our result array, and we have our float h, or our float height, and our float weight, we can then push these into our results. So we can say result.push, and here we will just push float h, and then result.push, and we will push float w, and then at the very end we just want to return result, and this will return the array of the results. We will only have 2 in there, and the 0 index will be the height, and the first index will be the weight. So now we have our very first function done. We can then move on to our next one, which will be the one that is actually written inside of our index.html. So this is the one that is going to be, when the user clicks on the button, this is the function that's going to run. So what we'll do is we'll say true result, and then the first thing we'll say var results is equal to user input, and we will call this function here. Now next we will say var height is equal to results at index 0, and var weight is equal to results at index 1. And now we can create a body mass index that we can actually use some maths with. So to work out the BMI, you need to have your weight and then divide it by the height, and the height is actually times by it's raised to the power of 2. So what we'll have is var body mass index is equal to weight divided by, and then in brackets, height, and then 2 asterisks, and then 2. So this will just have height raised to the power of 2, and then you'll have weight divided by that. Now we can then, because this will actually return a number that, it won't be that attractive for trying to work out what we actually want to show to the user, because it may have different numbers. It may have, say, 6 or 7 decimal places. So there's a lot of things that we can actually try and combat with that. So what we'll actually do is we'll say body mass index, and we will reassign it now to be equal to math.round. And here we're just going to pass in the body mass index, and then times by 100, and then so this will just times it by 100, and it will round it. And now we have the number to a certain degree outside of the decimal place. We can then round it and then divide by 100. So when it's divided by 100, it will then come back to a much cleaner and much nicer number. So next we'll have another variable, and this will be for the result. So we'll say result LE, and then we'll say document dot get element by by ID, and we'll pass in result. And then now we will say result LE dot inner HTML, and we will say in backticks your BMI is, and then here we will pass in a $, and then curly braces, and we will say body mass index. And then because we have that, we now just want to actually call the next function, which will check to make sure what our result actually is. So we will say show result, and we will pass in body mass index. And now we can move on to our third and final function. So we will say function show result, and here we'll just say BMI, because we need to have a parameter within our brackets to make sure that we are passing in an argument when this function has been called. So now we'll say var show weight LE is equal to document LE.getElementById, and we'll say weight result. And now here we'll say if the BMI is less than or equal to 18.5, then we will show weight LE.innerHTML, and we will change the inner HTML to say weight type and then underweight. So now we have our first if statement back. So if whatever is calculated here is less than 18.5, then we will show that the user is underweight. And then we will say else if BMI is greater than 18.5, and make sure it's a double and here, and less than or equal to 24.9. Sorry, and the BMI is less than or equal to 24.9, then we will show weight LE.innerHTML, and then this will say weight type, and we will pass in normal. Now we'll say else if BMI is greater than 25 and BMI is less than or equal to 29.9, then we will say, don't know how that happened, then we will say show weight element, and we'll change the inner HTML to say weight type being overweight. And then else if the BMI is greater than 30, then we are going to show weight LE, and we'll change the inner HTML to say weight type obese. And now, just for good measure, because you never know, if it's not coming back with anything, then we might have some kind of error, and it might be to do with the actual return of the maths that we've done here. So what we can now say is else. So if it doesn't come back with any of these numbers, then we can say else, and we'll just say console log there is an error. So now if we save this and then head back to our page and refresh. So now if I type in a height of say 1.6 and a weight of say 95 and calculate, we get your BMI is 37.11 and your weight type is obese. So we'll then change it to 1.2 and we'll say 55 and calculate 38.19, and it's still obese, but if we change this to 30, then we get normal. So we actually have a working BMI calculator here. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this has helped your understanding on how we can call a function with certain HTML tags, making them more interactive by combining it with JavaScript. If you liked what we've been through and you want to learn more, please drop a like and subscribe to my channel to keep up to date. In the coming weeks, I will be releasing a free 30 days of Python guide, so stay tuned and make sure you're ready to claim yours.